Hey Mark,
Morning.
how you doing?
Morning. Pretty
Hawaii?
good. Yes.
How is it there?
It's interesting. It's cool. It's
Hmm.
we've only been here a day, so I'm still actually capable of getting up at this hour. But
Mhm.
it's cool and windy, and so it's funny to see the Hawaiians walking around in their coats that I would probably now wearing back in Minneapolis.
That's funny. So which island you on?
Kauai.
Okay.
Yeah, we're in the same place we always go.
Mhm.
It's interesting. We've rented, I don't know how many years now, 4 or 5, 6 maybe. And you come back and you open up your laptop and it still works, so they haven't changed the password, and the
Mhm. Mhm.
the lock key to get in the door is still the same.
Mhm.
So chair is still in the same, my favorite chair is still in the same place.
Oh, there you go.
So it's just like
Little continuity
being
is nice sometimes.
being in a different home. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. Cool. Okay. Hey everybody. Looks like we're missing Tim. He's usually the first on
Yeah.
the line. All right.
Eric said he'd be traveling, so that's no surprise.
Tim did? Oh, I missed that.
Eric,
Oh,
Eric.
Eric did. Okay. Yeah. Eric's usually about on time, but Tim is usually oftentimes kind of waiting here when I start the Zoom.
Where does he connect from then? Is that
I think
is that
a
a favorite
cafe
restaurant?
in Dubai.
Cafe, yeah, I was
Yeah,
thinking.
yeah. So I think he's and it's much later there, of course. So it's not the crack of dawn like it is for you, Mark. Or before the crack of dawn, really. Is that
Before, yeah.
darkness behind you in the window?
Yeah, well, yeah, usually I'm turned around the other way. The sun comes up back here, so I have to I
Hmm.
partly it's a matter of where I can reach a plug-in from.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, it's still cold here in the cities. And I think we had a
Just as
little snow. I
exciting.
wasn't really paying attention last night. I think as I was working right here on the computer, I, my little, I've got a little, whatever it is, a widget up there that says what the weather is in St. Paul. And I think there was a bar of snow for the next hour or so that I saw for a while. And I haven't been outside to check it out yet. So,
It's not so much the weather report we want to hear, it's the extrajudicial killings that
yeah.
we're curious about.
Yeah, not a lot of news on that really. There does seem to be some indication that nobody's backing down on either side. That that the administration is sort of pursuing some type of either prosecution or just sort of general purpose harassment of the mayor of Minneapolis and the governor of Minnesota. Which is, not to say that, maybe they don't uh, warrant some investigation on account of this, this kind of monster fraud case that's been going on for years and has been kind of ignored, diligently ignored for years. But certainly the ICE situation has just added a layer of kind of mayhem and kind of ridiculous over the top, really
Yeah, I
stormtrooper
think it's
stormtrooper
confusing
tactics on top of
how the two are interrelated.
it. Yeah.
And
Yeah, I think
and
there's
I think that it's been confusing to people on both sides who think
yeah,
you're doing this thing, but you're really doing this thing. And
right.
um,
Right. Well, and it has been sort of, I think that people have said, and probably rightly said, that, that a lot of this kind of springs out of just the reckless throwing of money at everybody and everything during COVID. right? And so, and so that probably, I think the expectation is that probably scams like this exist everywhere, right? It just happens to be that in Minnesota, the scam seems to have been largely perpetrated by, an immigrant
Smalls.
community that is a natural target for the current administration. So it's
Well,
a perfect storm for them.
and given that there have been ongoing investigations and prosecutions, um, it's unclear what happens with that. If it's because I keep hearing about people being under investigation, and then I don't know if it never goes to trial, or because there's millions missing,
Yeah, yeah.
and
I mean,
it'd be
anywhere from
very
hundreds
nice.
of millions to
Yeah.
billions. Nobody really knows.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think
Well,
you rightly said last week, Mark, didn't you, that there probably isn't 7 or 9 billion. And that's probably true. But but it's enough, and it's a combination of apparently federal and state taxpayer money that everybody ought to be concerned, and everybody ought to be kind of interested in, in sort of seeing it resolved, and at least stopped, if not, the kind of the people who were in on it kind of brought to some kind of justice.
Right.
I'm less concerned about that than just that it stops.
It seems it was, like you say, it's very advantageous, people bringing services into being from nothing and being able to get money to provide these services. And then it always seems questionable about this, whether the service was really provided. I
Right.
mean, I have one relative who works in, works at a special autism school in Minneapolis. And so that when the autism strand of this overall fraud thing came up, what it sounded like is they were paying parents to have their kids diagnosed so they could supposedly be treated. So I don't know how so many of those things slip under the radar with all of the documentation, at
Hmm.
least for that kind of situation, that
Yeah.
you would have to generate.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
who
Well,
looks at that?
it's weird too, because I mean, something like autism, being on the spectrum is such. I mean,
Yeah,
I guess I was going to say it's a subjective
it is.
evaluation,
Well,
right? It
well,
seems.
certainly
okay, it's
when
not that subjective. I mean, I've got a fair amount of autism in my family, and there are plenty of people who are
severely, yeah.
severely, again, and that includes both of my sister's sons. There, there has been relatively recently, it's a sort of, I think people self-diagnosing themselves, from magazine articles about, oh, that's why I'm an asshole, when lots of people are just assholes. Um,
The Elon Musk thing, yeah.
or for that matter, whereas my sister, again, who's pretty, she just doesn't just have two, autistic sons. I mean, both of them, but is actively involved in uh, sort of managing a community resource center where that provides sort of daily services for a few dozen
Mhm.
severely autistic kids.
Yeah.
Fairly expert opinion is my father. Our is certainly on the spectrum. He's also an asshole. So, but he's an asshole who's obsessed with trains and goes off on long tangents and doesn't understand other relations.
Right.
So again, there's subjectivity. There is a pretty people. Lots of things are subjective self-diagnosis things. Again,
Mhm. Okay.
I
Well, let me clarify a little bit. The experience that I was going by to say subjective, and it's on the edge. It's not the severe autism side of it, obviously. But my son was tested last year, and at a very kind of substantial, big center on the on West River Parkway that's been doing this thing for years. And he went through, a kind of a whole morning, sort of battery of tests and interviews with, with different people and stuff. And they concluded ultimately that he was not autistic in the way that, that would kind of fit the way that they were defining it. But it did seem at that edge, when I talked to the people afterwards, that there were a bunch of kind of criteria that were autism like, that could be attributed to other conditions. And so I guess that's what I meant about it being a little bit, I guess, fuzzier than I remember it being, when I was much younger, and autism seemed to be much rarer. And probably will, what you were implying is probably also true, that there are people who are, sort of self-diagnosing and jumping on a bandwagon, and using, autism or Asperger's as, kind of an excuse for bad behavior, and saying, well, it's not me, it's my mental illness, kind of that thing. But
And it was a similar situation. Yeah, again, I'm sure we've run across, people who are suddenly gluten sensitive.
right, sure,
It's
yeah,
just no, it's an excuse to, and again, I know that there are people who are actually gluten sensitive, but they're
right.
suddenly gluten sensitive, but it's really more that, they're trying to avoid carbohydrates because they feel like it's a way to lose weight.
Mhm.
But
I can't tell how many
It,
people blushed when he said gluten sensitive.
I I
I did
was
not.
thinking, so I've got a wheat allergy, which is not
uh,
gluten sensitivity. And whenever I
yep,
say, well, like, oh, I've got a wheat allergy, wait staff will go, oh, you mean gluten, you have a gluten
yeah.
sensitivity. I'm like, no, I get a sinus tear if I have wheat.
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, you
Um,
don't experience the anxiety when you don't have enough weed?
Yeah. So, but yeah, there, and other, and certainly other things, right? There certainly are fads and fashions in the ways that we sort of kind of understand these terms, and use them much more loosely than we used to. And again, I'll go out on a limb where I don't have full scientific backing for this, but vague, difficult to define diseases as well. Fibromyalgia. What is that really exactly? Sort of these things that have become, kind of focuses, and probably in a way sort of serve as proxies for, sort of general metabolic unhealth or disease, or the effects of, kind of the food system that we live in, the processed manufactured food system, the pharma system, the mental health system, all of these things. But yeah, in any case, it does seem that there's, I don't even know how I started this this little tangent.
Well,
Um,
it's the general vagueness that's leading to so many problems now, and there's opportunities for all kinds of interpretations and
yeah,
spins
right.
that I think result, and I don't know how you ever get out of it. I mean,
Right.
that's
Well,
the
and also
problem.
group
You keep
membership, right? And and kind of belonging to an identity,
Yeah.
um,
right.
which
Well,
is
to tie it together to the prior conversation on government fraud and people taking money away from services that should have been, which I think is how we got here.
okay, sure.
Um, there apparently has been a huge issue with particularly military families who have kids with diagnosed issues that
Mhm.
should be put on educational plans. And as they move from,
Place to
hmm.
place.
school system to school system, there's just, and it's usually on a timeline of every 2 years you're moved to some new base.
Sure.
So your kid's in a school system, and it takes just that long for the local system to be forced and their
Right.
feet held to the fire to provide services for your kid with those things, which they never do. And then
Hmm.
you move to a new school system and you have to start all the paperwork crazy all over again. So,
Yeah.
it's,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
the issue too, on our prior question, is all these millions of dollars disappear, and they should have gone to a group of people that they never did, who managed to struggle their way through. Does that money after the fact go to those people ultimately, or does it just disappear, or it sits in the perpetrator's bank account until they pay a president or someone just enough money to get the pardon and be able to keep the rest of the money that's left?
Yeah.
No
Or maybe get two
restitution.
pardons.
Yeah.
We had somebody just get his second somebody just get their second pardon.
Got a second pardon. I missed that.
Oh yeah, it was
Yeah.
yesterday.
I know. I know. It's bad
Fraud
that
both times too. Fraud both
this
times.
the current administration is obviously doing some kind of quid pro quo crazy. But I'm still. There was the woman from Dixon, Illinois, who absconded with 5+ million and was investing it in her horse farm
Oh
Mm,
yeah.
in the early 2000s, and Biden quietly pardoned her. Although I think she spent a decade or more in prison,
mm,
but he quietly pardoned her at the end of his term, and it was never explained the how or the why, or did she actually repent and something happened? But
mm.
most of that money at least was bound back up and hopefully went back to the community. Um, but it's also the case too where I wonder, like, small governments should be able to see other small governments around them to know, okay, our city is this certain size. This is what our book should look like.
Mhm.
Um, so you can cross compare, because that fraud went on for, I think, the better part of 10 years or more.
Yeah.
That
Right.
lady
She
was
was
able
the government, right?
to
In that case,
yeah, she was put herself in a position, and then she hired the you know
yeah.
the accounting team that was supposed to find the fraud, but somehow paid them off or told them not to find the fraud. And I
Mm,
think some of those guys went to jail too.
right.
Um,
Right. Well, this all.
The never ending. There is always the never ending mantra of, oh, we're gonna save all this money through cutting down on waste, fraud, and abuse. And then when you actually do cut down, you waste, fraud, and abuse actually, comes down to like, okay, maybe it's 2 or 3%.
Mhm.
Yeah. Or my favorite one is, the kind of, the welfare, the work requirement. You have to verify your work requirements for welfare in certain places. And when you do that, the main effect is to deny qualified working people who don't have time to go through the paperwork to get their benefits.
Mhm.
As opposed, and it costs actually more to do the enforcement on the investigating the paperwork and all that bureaucracy than you're actually saving in terms of these things. So,
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, this all
what's any
seems
of
like
this
it's
got to do
getting.
with what's any of
Oh.
this got to do with this book?
Well,
well,
I was going to say this all seems like it's chapter
It-
6, the shame
to,
and blushing
yeah.
thing, but maybe we should jump back
I
to
love
chapter
that.
4
well,
and
my
and theory of
initial
mind.
my initial question about the extrajudicial killings in Minnesota, which went in a different direction than I expected. Part of that point was the good story totally maps onto the tail end of chapter 5
Yeah.
on the Department of Social
Yeah.
Relations, and the person who's killed becomes the symbol for the thing that's wrong in the community, and the community rises up, and the knowledge of what happened is what fuels the community with their knowledge of what's happened to rise up. The issue here is another, and maybe it's a good thing or a bad thing depending on the administration, but this particular administration takes a very Roy Cohn perspective of, if you're attacking me, I don't care what it is. If it's true or not, I'm going to attack you back.
Mhm.
Way worse,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
To the point where we got the prosecutor who was actually the federal prosecutor who's actually running the case against the fraud, resigning because, and half that office is resigning also because they're completely, investigating investigating a murder victim was just a bridge too far.
Yeah. Well, okay. So that was so we jumped from chapter 6 to chapter 5. Let's go all the way back to chapter 4. Uh, so Daniel Dennett and theory of mind, the chimpanzees and the children, which struck me as kind of interesting but sort of reductive. And then he goes on to say, well, a computer can emulate
Yeah.
this, this type of thing. A digital computer can easily distinguish multiple instances of a concept. They're simply stored in separate slots of memory. And then he does this elaborate demonstration of what a great computer scientist he is because he can use register addresses in a table. And
Yeah.
and and from there, I mean, it was weird. I didn't really think that was an especially kind of useful analogy, or maybe I misunderstood what it was supposed
Mhm.
to be telling us about, kind of human thought. It does seem like, yeah, the way that a system deals with, I mean, in that case, I guess belief is a function that can be applied to a bunch of different actors or circumstances. But was that kind of relevant to understanding, human behavior?
It was odd. And one of the things in reading it, I thought chapter 4 was like one of the better chapters.
Yeah.
Um, because it mostly mostly was cohesive. Um, but as I was reading through chapter 4, and part of it was there was a piece that was missing, which was context.
Hmm.
Because if you are missing context, being able to do the traceability of how many levels of abstraction and extension that you have, it starts getting difficult because you don't know what the context is, why, what somebody knows, or flipping things, or
Hmm.
just the ever-present code switching,
Hmm.
where you have one person using another person's term, supposedly for clarity, and then you have the person they're talking to using that person's term, supposedly for clarity. And as you just have, it gets very complicated and very messy. And part of what was keeping that in mind was Alicia Guerrero has a new book out, Why Context Matters, which is a precursor to her book, Context Changes Everything. And it's sort of a deep philosophical look at complexity and context and so forth.
Hmm.
But was in a discussion with her earlier this week about her new book.
Hmm.
Um, and it was just interesting, just that context was missing from Pinker.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it was very sort of sterile in that way. But I thought it was relatively good. There was quite a few things that I liked, and it was when I was going through and doing an awful lot of work around folksonomy and understanding, you know, explicit terms that people were applying to objects,
Hmm.
and using terms from multiple domains. And so tagging something from a knowledge management perspective and information architecture perspective, a pure social sciences, and just having been to an awful lot of academic symposiums looking at social technologies and just sort of understanding what people are meaning in environments,
Hmm.
um, keeping the term straight for what all of this is called. It's like each domain discussing, you know, that matter of what people call things.
Hmm.
It was really problematic because you'd have four different domains and disciplines in a room, and they all have their own distinct terms, roughly
Right.
meaning the same thing. And just sort of keeping track of which terms mean what, which philosophers and philosophical foundations um, are sort of core to everything.
Hmm.
Um, it was always, and
And are the distinctions significant, or are they just somebody,
not
somebody putting a flag on a territory and and claiming it as their
they're
own?
they're not necessarily doing it to claim, but they're trying to discuss things in from the perspective that they understand.
Mhm.
And having sort of the symposiums with people from
Generous
different
interpretation. Yeah.
academic domains,
Yeah.
you'll have people who are like, you go to enough of them, you are able to sort of do the code switching and then say, oh, this person, they're using this term, and that's the same term as this other term that these two other domains use. And you're like, oh, okay.
Right.
But it's just like that's what they're familiar with.
Mhm.
And me being a quasi outsider, all of the terms were familiar and foreign at the same time. And knowing who was using which term when, I'm like, I just couldn't keep the term straight.
Right.
And
Okay.
because you would also have code switching. I'm like, wait, this person with this background is using this term, but it's for the rest of the room because they
Yeah.
know that their term is sort of, you know, not the one that everybody else would understand.
Right.
And so it was highly entertaining, particularly around the domain of the discussions and
Mhm.
just sort of, which is largely chapter 4, and like who is understanding what. And like, I know that you know that I know that you know,
Mhm.
but you're doing that across that understanding, and it gets very muddled and messy very quickly when
Mhm.
you're going across domains
Yeah.
and just sort of having that context. And I was like reading through it and just sort of chuckling as I was reading through it. I'm like, oh, this is a really good simple overview. But he was lacking on one of the things I was really hoping to get out of this book was being able to have a clear understanding of terms, and wasn't I like chapter 4 an awful lot, but getting clear terms out of it, for just having something to glom onto and say, this is what it means from Pinker's understanding, here's what
Right.
the various terms are.
Right. Yeah. I think, I mean, a couple things in that whole section that sort of jumped out at me were, sort of the simple coordination,
Mhm.
the Australian coral sex
Yep.
after the full moon of spring or whatever, struck me as an interesting kind of counterexample of all of this very sort of metacognitive
Hmm.
stuff that that kind of humans are doing. And then I still kind of struggle with this question of, you were being very generous about, these domains. Thomas. I'm still thinking,
Yep.
is Pinker, complexifying this beyond its need in order to have a topic to write about, and specifically, at one point he says, we concluded that private knowledge and common knowledge are distinctive mental states which reliably light up in the mind, free from the cognitive burden of recursive mentalizing. And I think what he's summing
Hmm.
up there is the point, he's talked about all these different levels of kind of recursion in the
Hmm.
mentalizing. And then at that point he seems to be saying, well, in real life, it seems like people don't really do this. What they do is that, they either understand things as private or as fully public. And,
Hmm.
and maybe a little bit of nuance is lost in that oversimplification. But the implication that I got out of it, maybe I was reading between the lines and maybe I was reading my own interpretation into it, was that is a significant enough distinction that it kind of works in real life most of the time, and is probably the one that's evolutionarily relevant,
Yeah,
right?
Hmm.
that was one of the things I brought up last week was the he knows that she knows that he knows that she. How many of those do you go through and how applicable it is? And I appreciated that at least in this section they discussed some tests that they ran. Like, does everybody, I think there was an example, does everybody recurse to the point that the value is zero,
Hmm.
which is where you would get to logically after 4 or 5 iterations. You
Right.
see it's going to zero, that's where the limit is. But in practice, people drew the limit. I think it was like 22% or 33% in the example that he showed
Hmm.
is a useful thing. And that's, to me, that's interesting to see where is that gray area of what actually happens.
Hmm.
But he also, in discussing a lot of these things, in the blushing section, he's talking about things as innocuous as who farted, and are
Yeah.
you going to blush at that because everyone knows or not? and he doesn't get to examples of, you know, the present government we've got, the executive in chief seems to be so narcissistic and doesn't have any of these mechanisms. He's not going to blush, he's not going to care, he can't be held accountable, whether everyone knows that everyone knows, because he doesn't seem to know or ignores the fact and is papering it over, either because of the mental issues he had growing up, or even worse, because of the, present, you know, t- frontotemporal dementia that he seems to be have from a medical diagnostic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the key symptoms of that is the idea of confabulation, where this thing happens and this thing happens, but you can't you don't have the mental acuity to draw the line from A to B. So
Mm-hmm.
you just make up what you think happened in
Right.
between them.
Right. Much
And
much less assess
that's
whether it's
you know
correlation or causal or whatever. Yeah.
yeah, so
Mhm.
that's one of the things is how do these and it's an important thing that I wish he was drawing more, because he's written this in after we've gone through a decade of this crazy now.
Mm-hmm.
But and he's got the examples, but how do you function with these, simple game theory squares
Yeah.
when one actor is so obviously not playing the same game everyone else is,
Mhm.
and then what happens?
Yeah.
What does that? How does that drive the system? Because the small examples of the farts, are simple and fairly straightforward, but it gets massively more complex when the two sides are not playing the same game at all.
And we're stealing Greenland.
Like just, are you going to invade and take over some other country, or how does the rest of the world play when they know this person is not going to be in power?
Yeah.
Ostensibly we're at the roughly almost the 18-month period, which is the time period that a president has to be able to do anything.
Right.
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 We're
So we're
almost
almost we're
past
almost
that.
we're almost
And it,
getting
it
ready to
gets
enter
even
the
worse
lane
if the
bucket.
House and the Senate flip,
Yeah.
and then he's just done.
Yeah. Yeah.
If they flip to a certain degree. But then the question is, well, how does the rest of the world in that game theory perspective switch
Mm-hmm.
with whatever the next, you know, or is this a longer term course change for the next 50 or 100 years? Or does sanity prevail and we come back and America decides, okay, we're gonna play with all the nice people again, rather than, sidling up to the despots and the crazy.
Right.
Back specifically, because when we're talking about blushing, and that shame that again, I thought that was one of the things I also liked about this section, these three chapters. That was, again, as I mentioned, I just don't find the looping iterative stuff very interesting. I do enough of that professionally. Yeah.
Oh, what is your professional background? What do you do?
I write code, man.
Oh, so we have context.
Yeah, and not
Yeah.
just and again, one of the first thing I learned in my first computer science class was, you make something else do the loops.
Right.
Yeah, it's
Yep.
like, so you don't have to go through anything anyway. But that's the physiology and psychology of blushing is, as I remember from just reviewing it, it comes down to an acknowledgement of guilt, and correct and possible correction or whatever. Am I sort of remembering that right? And you know, that is an interesting, sort of unique way of looking at it that I hadn't thought about it. And uh, and yes, Dan, that's the important thing, is while when we're talking about loops anyway. So, but yeah, and so when we think about that in international relations, all right, and I think again later on he goes about, oh, here's all these statements, and one of them is, state, nations are people, I think. Again, I'm paraphrasing and
Mhm.
probably, so, is America going to blush?
Yeah.
Are we going to are we blushing as a way of signaling to the rest of the world? Oh, this we know we did bad, and if we do, then we get back to what we had this internal rants a few years ago about Obama's supposed apology tour,
Mhm.
uh, which well, he didn't actually. Again, what the truth is versus what is less important than what the sort of to what we're talking about here than what the
Sure.
actual public perception and sort of talking points are. So yeah, do we think America is going to blush?
Right.
And what does that really indicate? And what does that
Well,
eh,
and
go
does the fact that the world knows that some or a lot or 51% of America is blushing right now or whatever,
Mhm.
yeah,
is that actually a foreign policy?
Yeah.
Right?
yeah,
Well,
A way of kind of signaling that, this too shall pass, and and the clock is actually kind of ticking on it. We hope. One of the things that along the way, to kind of pull us back briefly just to chapter 4 and the theory of mind thing again, is this idea that the Keynes example I thought was interesting. I'd never heard that story about about the each competitor has to pick not the faces that which he himself finds prettiest, but those which he thinks likeliest to catch the fancy of other competitors, all of whom are looking at the problem from the same point of view. And this is Keynes's words in his description of this contest that he was talking about in the 30s, right? And I thought that actually was kind of significant and had some teeth to it, and kind of was the basis of a legitimate analysis and kind of commentary on Pinker's part. As I continued through that chapter, one of the things that did strike me though, and then it was only reinforced when we got to the parts about American politics and Trump and stuff that happened in the later chapters is bad behavior. I mean, a lot of a lot of these examples, a lot of these implementations of game theory and analyses of game theory seem to assume that we're going to try to, shirk the landlord's request, right? We're going to try to get out of, any type of kind of shared responsibility. We're going to, I mean, and again, I mentioned this, I think last week, right? It's kind of the classic, baked into this is sort of the classic tragedy of the commons analysis, right? Which I think, for all of his, purported optimism about humanity and the better angels and all of this, and I was also struck by how many of his books he cited in these chapters. But for all of that, he seems to have this kind of zero sum
Yeah.
tragedy of the commons kind of assumption baked into this. And so it seemed to me a little bit along the way, I just thought, oh, this is kind of depressing. We're talking about people being shitty again. And we're talking about, about theories of mind of people being shitty,
yeah,
which I thought was,
well, some of it goes back to how do we as groups of people make sense of the world. So there's all of us reading this book and trying to make sense of what's in this book, and there's only five of us, so it's an easier problem than how do you do that at scale with millions. So even the Keynes example of how do you do these things, and he kind of draws an analogy to American voting systems and how we do primaries. Like, do you vote for the person you really would like to vote for, or do you modify that because your person has no chance
Right.
to fill in that politics, so you choose the one that's next most acceptable, and that's who you actually vote for? And how does that work at multiple levels versus what if our election system was set up in such a way that you had ranked choice voting and you could vote and give 5 points to the person you really wanted and then give 3, 2, and 1 points to the runners up.
Right.
What does that look like?
Right.
Where do we end up as a group in a society? And or how does that change the calculus of how you think about how everyone else thinks about who they're going to vote for?
Right. But we do kind of have that in the Iowa caucus, right?
I actually live someplace where we have ranked choice voting. New York City, at least in our primaries. And it worked out just fine as far as I'm concerned, but I'm very left. But he also got a majority of votes in the where we don't have ranked choice voting in the general election.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. Well, I think that, Chris, I think ranked choice voting was sort of the obvious kind of other thing, but I think he did kind of misunderstand, the primary process, because as I understand the primary process, a lot of it, a lot of caucuses are about a back and forth
Yeah.
that ultimately achieves a consensus. So he's kind of oversimplifying, to make this a binary opposition, that process, and then again,
Well,
I guess,
most game theorists are gonna split things down to try and provide a binary one. It's
yeah,
all or nothing, which is how most of game theory is laid out
yeah,
as a
okay,
model at the lowest level. So you have to. In fact, as I'm reading this, I'm almost thinking like, hey, there's some psychological studies, and I've pulled more papers to read other stuff that has happened since I last read a whole lot of game theory a decade ago.
mhm,
Because, I've spent a fair amount of time in evolutionary theory and information theory that there's a huge amount of overlap with what he's writing with things that I would naturally read
sure,
as a, professional thing.
mhm,
Um, but, I wonder, like, would my time have been even better spent instead of coming up to speed with current literature that he's writing about, just reading, Morgenstern all over again, from God, what is that? The mid 30s, I think.
Mm.
Um, you know,
mhm,
maybe I should have read that again, and that would have been a better use of time. But some of these, I think what's interesting here is where a lot of that game theory stuff, where the rubber meets the road with the psychology piece of and so a lot of this I would put into the area of like behavioral economics of, okay, so you have the game theory of here's what we would expect to happen. What happens at the psychological level when people actually are making choices? Are
mhm,
they doing it fully rationally, or are they doing it in that gray space in between? And then what happens as a result of that?
mhm, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
because we as a society, we're always telling ourselves stories about you watch the talking heads on any political news network, whether it's as insane as Newsmax or all the way up to, the more fact-driven stuff. There are stories we're telling ourselves to try to come to some consensus of what should we be doing about this current topic.
mhm, yeah,
And how do we actually so we can come to a psychological consensus, but then what can we do to physically hold the feet of our elected officials to the fire to actually implement that thing? And currently, I think the majority of the country is in the space that we don't want to see ICE doing what ICE is doing right now, but we have no mechanism by which to actually force that as a society to happen.
mhm,
In the usual time where the House and the Senate would have at least some power, that might shift and change. Or if the administration was willing to blush a little bit, that might change. But we've painted ourselves into such a political corner that even when it's broad consensus on things like, more than 80% of the country believes abortion should be a thing. I mean, even Catholic Ireland is over the 60% point. And that to me is shocking.
mhm,
But you have these numbers in America where the vast majority of people in a democracy, and not just like 0.1% over the 50-50 line, but 80, 90% of America thinks, hey, we should be doing this. and yet somehow we're doing totally opposite.
Mhm.
And
But
that,
see, that's
you know,
also, I think, why so many of these issues they would like to get Congress to vote on.
Mhm.
yeah,
So, because the hope is, I guess, that the congressmen in casting a vote for something they know is unpopular would at least blush.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it does seem like, with something like abortion, a big part of the battle seems to be kind of about kind of gerrymandering the framing of the debate, right? And kind of making it about something. One of the things, and along these, and I don't have enough expertise really to have an opinion from the psychological or neuroscience perspective, but so I tend to use analogies from areas of my own expertise. And so so I lose confidence when I run across things like his description of banking. The bank, for its part, doesn't just pile up the deposits in a mountain of cash like Scrooge McDuck. It lends money out with interest to home by blah, 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 blah. He has no idea how banking works.
yeah.
It's
Well, it's
ridiculous. I mean, it's a ridiculous oversimplification, and creating this binary of either having money on deposit or instance one of reloaning that money out. Well, what happens to that money that's loaned out on a mortgage? Well, it's paid to somebody who deposits it, right? And then, and so this cycle is, it continues and continues. And not having any type of a sense of, kind of the complexity of that, does strike me as an example of these kind of just so stories that are just kind of plopped into place like pegs in a pegboard to kind of support his argument without, maybe really meaning what he thinks they mean. And I want,
yeah.
and so that
Mhm.
leads me to wonder about his, the psychology and the game theory and the stuff as well.
Well, it's that you're playing that same game as you, what do you know that he knows, and he doesn't know that you know anything,
There you go.
because it's a book. So, but there are levels within even the banking system that were tightened after the crash in '08 that you had to keep a certain amount of cash on hand every day to, you know,
Reserve requirement.
to
Yeah.
work against
Mhm.
those. And that's part of the regulations and requirements to fit into the FDIC model.
Yeah.
And we've already since, loosened a lot of those restrictions that
Mhm.
were in place. And then the question is that a good thing or a bad thing in the long term for creating future potential runs on banks?
Right.
Because, we're humans and we always forget our history and then end up getting into trouble as a result of it.
Yeah.
But those are the kinds of policy questions that you need to say, hey, where are we in a growth stage or are we in a pullback stage? And should that then be tied where the overall economy is going? Should that be tied to confidence levels of how much money a bank should have on hand based on what the rest of the economy is doing? But that's very hard to put into law and get it passed because the Republicans think, oh, hey, we want less regulation so we can have freewheeling, whatever. And,
Right. Right. And maybe we want regulators who aren't subject to recall. Things like
yeah,
that.
or who
Mhm.
are beholden to,
Yeah.
a despot who can fire them at will and,
Right.
or, weaponize a Department of Justice against them.
Right. Well, it's interesting because, I agree. I mean, it's complex, but that's one of the things that's frustrating me about this book is I'm not seeing, kind of as much grappling with the complexity as I am seeing kind of quippiness, right?
Yeah.
His little quip about Silicon Valley Bank and, was it, I can't remember. I can't
Well,
pull it off
that
the top
was
of my
the
head.
thing too, is even
Yeah.
reading two or three news articles about that bank collapse that week. Even within a week, there was so much information about what happened
Hmm.
that usually would have taken a decade or more
Yeah.
to come out,
Yeah.
based on my reading over the last 3 decades of, that kind of news.
Hmm.
And he spends maybe a half a paragraph
Yeah.
on it. So there's a huge amount of complexity that he's missing in this book to
Right.
talk about that thing.
That's what I'm saying. It's just
Um,
he's reduced it to something that, that really just is a vehicle for a punchline.
but it also could be the
And
case too that he can't address all of it in super heavy detail because then nobody would read this book. So
Yeah.
the interesting thing for me is he's providing, if nothing else in this, if you're into this area, he's providing a huge number of examples that you could play with.
Hmm.
And that bank instance could be its own book on this topic, or at least
mhm.
a nice long journal article.
Right.
And I might prefer
Looking
to
at it
read
from
the
his
nice long
perspective.
journal article to delve into that,
Right.
but he can't get into it here.
Yeah.
But I think the bigger issue too is even from a psychological research standpoint, even some of the basic rubber meets the road on simple cases at the individual level, it's more complex than we think it is. So what happens then when you scale that up to the level of not just one individual and their choice, but millions of individuals and their choices as it relates to a bank failure
Hmm.
is dramatically more complex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
I think
Yeah. This is,
there's a point that Dan made that I actually really agree with, and I want to expand a little bit on. And you're talking about his negativity, the zero sum game stuff, right? And a lot of what we're talking about with the bank run and a few of the other things is, he seems to be mixing like three different kinds of books here, and none of them very well. You know, I mean, the part that I find the most interesting, again, because I don't really have a psychology background, is when he's telling me facts about child development and the like, and that's interesting to me. Or telling me facts about, okay, here's a piece of research that happened, but then he's mixing in that again, as sort of implied policy prescriptions based on how and and based on his implied fairly negative view of the world, the zero sum view of the world.
Assume
Um,
selfishness.
Hmm.
yes, yeah, exactly. And again, that assumes selfishness combined with absolutely, drastic simplifications of some of his examples. I mean, I remember, one that it was like, oh, Ariel Sharon took a stroll on the Temple Mount, with didn't mention and that's what caused the Intifada, not yeah, okay,
Right.
there was a lot of other things going on, those sorts of little things where he's like, oh, this is again, he's trying to do three different things and none of them very well, and that was my frustration. But
well,
but yeah, go ahead.
that's part of the thing though with all these stories is we'll look in the news and see the stroll as the thing that broke the camel's back, and it's so what the news is doing is it's trying to inform all of us to give us a story, but invariably most of us in you know Israel Palestinian conflicts, none of us are there on the ground to see the daily day to day of what's going on.
And I want to
And
preemptively apologize for
yeah.
raising that
oh
subject,
yeah,
which is
no, no,
always the
no,
ultimate killer of any conversation.
but that's the thing is it's those are kind of what Dan calls the just so stories of
Yeah.
we're boiling down a huge amount of complexity into small digestible things that I know that you know that I know
Hmm.
types of and where
And
does that when it hits
Well,
the psychology of not just an individual person but groups of people, larger groups of people at the level of parties and then at the level of a nation. And our nation, then the way we perceive those things,
mhm.
it could be dramatically different than some other nation
Right.
for a variety of reasons, which is really what he's trying to get to in this book. But the levels of complexity that I think are arising there are so difficult to peel
mhm.
away his rational viewpoint of, hey, we should be able to study these things at these levels. And he's not mentioning words like complexity or emergence.
Hmm.
Really, that's what's happening is there is a story emerging out of all of these things that allow us to either make sense or not of
Yeah.
what's happening. And
Yeah.
I think that's some of the friction Dan's feeling. I certainly feel it
Yeah.
too
Yeah.
here.
Well,
You
and
know,
also,
There-
I'm sorry, Thomas, go ahead.
yeah. One of the things in this first chapter, and it's something that I've dealt with on dealing with currently, doing work around boundary spanning elements and helping shortcut or um, be a precursor to having problems from not understanding differences across boundaries, teams working together or organizations working together, and so forth. What are the things that you need to figure out up front that are different, and how do you work? Because you'll run into you know 5-figure, 8-figure problems by
Hmm.
not figuring that out up front, or like stoppage of a project while you work through. We thought we were working on this together and we would co-own it at the end of it, and we're working on it in a federated environment, but as soon as the project's done, you own it. We didn't think that.
Hmm.
So everybody stops. And so going through, I have a laundry list that I've been building over like 20 some years of all the lessons learned. I've asked this up front, figure out all these pieces,
Hmm.
and have sort of a triage list of, does this matter? Is legal? Is IP? Is this something that's going to come into play? If yes, set it aside. We'll come back to it. And you figure out where you don't have agreement. You don't have the I know that you know, and we're on the same page.
Hmm.
But going back to college, I had a professor, turned into not only one of my favorite professors, but also one of my favorite people. I would write papers for his class. And he's like, Thomas, you're missing stones to get people across the creek. He's like, you're making logical assumptions, which are good and correct, but you're taking 2 jumps or 3 jumps, and nobody else is going to be able to make those. You've got to put the stones in the creek to get people across
Hmm.
and understanding. And so I it was it was something I always push back on. I'm like, but this makes sense. I'm like, we are all in the same class. We are all doing the same work. How do we not know this? Why do I need to put the stones in? And I'm like, I have a page limit. And I'm like, if I put all this other stuff in, then I can't get to the fun stuff.
Hmm.
And over time, my work on my presentation started filling in all those stones to get people across the creek. But then you have people that are like, Thomas, we know this stuff. Why is it in there?
Hmm.
And
yeah.
I'm like figuring out the collective. I know that the fourth order or the fifth order. I'm
Hmm.
like, it's nearly impossible. So putting all of the stones in place and figuring out how you can have people skip stones because they know them,
Hmm.
um, is always a really tough problem. And I was hoping he was going to get to like addressing that, understanding what other people know or don't know. And it's just, it didn't quite get there.
Yeah.
Well, that's one of the things that's hard now in current political scenes is I know huge swaths of people are getting their news from sources that are just outright lying and misrepresenting the truth of what's going on. And I know that they know, but they don't seem to want to know what I know in return, which totally means that our game theory squares don't match up. We're playing 2 totally different games,
Yeah.
and my game
Well.
is different than your game. So
Hmm.
when so the Democratic Party is willing to throw Al Franken overboard for a thing he did, and that's the game the Democrats are playing, whereas the Republicans, they're happy to throw him over because he's not one of them. But when it does come to one of them who does the exact same thing, they totally won't throw him overboard. They keep him on because, oh, it's all about power at the end of the day.
Hmm.
But your issue too, Thomas, I see it's way more obvious in mathematics.
Hmm.
Those here's the argument A, B, C, D, and you can fill in everything within a proof. But
Yeah.
then you'll have somebody like Gregory or Perlman will solve a massive thing with a 200-page paper that he puts on archive. And it literally takes the best mathematicians in the world in groups of four or more 2 years to go through his proof to say, yes, we accept this proof as true. And
Yeah.
along the way, they're emailing Gregory Perelman, hey, we're missing the steps to get across the river. We
Mhm.
don't see
Yeah.
it. He comes back at them like, oh, and it's the kiss of death in the math community when you say it's easy to see that always means you're leaving out multiple steps. But if
Yeah.
you're at a level to be doing the research to read and understand a paper, when you get to that phrase and you don't, you're supposed to, when somebody in math says it's easy to see that, you're supposed to spend the 3 hours or weeks or days filling in all those things to show that, yes, you do know that that is the case, but the
Yeah.
writer knows a shorthand. I can't spend 20 more pages on this already 200-page paper to fill those pieces in. But if you have the ability to be reading this paper in the first place, you'll know you should be able to do that.
Mhm.
So my daughter can be taking algebra and she will spend a year on a 400-page, a 250-page book on math. But you get to the level of a graduate Springer text written by Sergey Lang, and he spends a page doing what she spent a year on because he
Yeah.
doesn't have the time. He knows you know that, so
Mhm.
he can skip to the complexity that at the end that he wants to get to.
Mhm. Let
And
me let me throw in
there's a huge gap.
yeah let me throw in a way in which the stuff that he's talking about politics is different from that, right?
Yeah.
Because
Okay.
that is kind of a question of sort of proofs. And he at one point says the annals of history are filled with examples. In 1739, a British ship captain was a victim of a malicious wounding by Spanish Coast Guard searching for contraband, setting off the 9 Year War of Jenkins' Ear. The USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in 1889. And the rallying cry, "Remember the Maine," egged the U.S. government into the Spanish-American War. Now, these are these jumped out at me, of course, but the thing that jumped out at me about them was that these are not causes. These are not the reasons why these things happen. These are the political rationales, right? These are the ex post
Yeah.
rationalizations of what we had previously decided for other reasons that we wanted to do. And Pinker's kind of inability to recognize this in a book about common knowledge, I
Yeah.
think is
Yeah.
really, really
Well,
problematic.
he does draw some of that, and I mean, there's more complexity to what's going on, and I think it's at the end of chapter 5, he talks about what is the group wide analog of the public insult that sparks a lethal brawl is the communal outrage. So you have
Yeah,
something
that's the
like,
previous paragraph. Yeah.
George Floyd
Right.
is the example that is the straw that breaks the country's camel's back. Yes, we all know that racism exists and people are being treated differently based on the most inane idea on the planet. But a lot of people are still bought into that old system and they don't want to acknowledge that it's an issue. So you get just enough people to elect somebody who says, "Oh, DEI is not a thing," and uses woke as a whip or a cudgel to kill the country with. But it's as a country, the majority of us still know that there are things that are wrong. So you roll those things up into the symbol that becomes the political whipping boy to turn that into a result.
Right.
So the cry of the Maine, everyone know at that time, everyone knew that everyone knew what was going on. You know, Steven Pinker obviously is not willing to delve into the specifics, but
Of
he
Pulitzer and
he identifies the thing that everyone would have known at the time. The main is the thing, and that's what pushes you into the result that you go to.
but wouldn't that be a more interesting thing to
Oh
kind
yeah,
of to
totally.
kind of
But
explore is how these things, how these very imperfect and often not even really, often events or incidents that really aren't what you thought they were get to carry all of this freight and get to be,
yeah.
George Floyd gets to be the poster boy of
Well,
BLM.
he's in this section, in this paragraphs, he's throwing spaghetti at the wall as here's a bunch of examples of
Yeah.
this type of thing.
Mhm.
I think what would have been beneficial and that you're looking for is choose one of those examples and flesh it out into a full chapter to show that yes, what I'm saying is true, and here's an
Well,
example blow by
right.
blow that lays it all out.
Yeah, in all its nuance. I mean, he talks about 15 pages back, he talked about, the guy who was running a charity and, and making a profit and said, and then he made 300, he gave $300 million to the poor or the homeless or somebody. And then he was shut down for making a profit. And he said, well, we could have been feeding people or we could have been doing whatever it was that
Yeah.
we were doing and stuff like that. It's like, and he leaves it at that. And it's sort of like, well, yeah, the guy also could have not been profiteering on his charity too. That was also a choice and an option.
Yeah, it's or the example he gives of this Steve Jobs gives $10 away while Bill Gates is over there giving away millions. Yet Jobs gets the better PR out of it,
Mhm.
Because it doesn't take credit.
because of and it was like, you know,
Yeah. Which was, and that was, by the way, that was one of the more, again, another one of the things, that whole May monies, that thing, that was one of the more interesting things to me, was sort of examining that, getting, and again, it gets back to the guy who made a profit feeding people. And whether or not that was even, and I forget actually the details of that story. I remember it vaguely, but what he wasn't necessarily being fraudulent in making a profit feeding people, but it's like but yeah, or even I think there's another term for sort of, but anyway, yeah, this if he's not being fraudulent, but he's still doing a good job, and there is greater good there, but again, people being angry that he's making a profit at it. And again, I work in the nonprofit sector. Almost every job I've ever had has been the nonprofit sector. Um, which is not that relevant, I guess. But yeah, again, that sort of getting getting more credit for how you give the money, that rather than what the effect, than the good about what came out of it.
yeah.
Uh,
Well, that same thing applies to politics and government. So there is a heuristic in the nonprofit space that if the nonprofit is spending more than 10% of their
30%. Yeah,
income
yeah,
on administration, it's probably not a great nonprofit.
right.
But it's incredibly telling that we do not have that same heuristic on government.
Yeah.
What percentage of government is spending on administration versus the good they're doing in the world? I wouldn't even begin to know how to come up with that number, and it's not calculated. The GAO doesn't put it out, and if they did, it would be a very politically divisive number to have in terms of, it's the same question of how do we determine what the level of poverty is, and we may be using calculations from 50 years ago when life was dramatically different to determine what poverty levels are now.
Mhm.
And how do you determine what the poverty level is in reality is a political question. So doing that, how much administration is the government doing, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? And maybe Trump's doing something interesting in firing all of this red tape. But the question also at the other side of it, as brought up in this example, is what is the good that's being done in society by having all those people employed and doing things, and the things that they're doing that's either good or not good for society. Where does that sit? You know,
Which
So
also
there's
maybe leads to
yeah.
the question, because I did find it very telling, and I went back to look for the actual thing so I could highlight it. I just remembered it from the first read was, that the recipients didn't care, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
They were not interested in Maimonides' ladder, which suggests to me maybe that Maimonides' ladder itself is kind of a first world problem, an obsession of people who, really ought to get out of their heads and do more and kind of think less about these issues. I don't know. That's just me.
To that also was, again, there was the actual Maimonides ladder, as written by that guy 1,000+ years ago, versus what his, with the, and not just the recipients, but with, his investigation with people. They actually switched a couple of these things where, where the telling of it did not match up with how people actually perceive these. And again, not counting the recipients, but just generally was. But again, that was it. But again, back to the book we wish he'd written. I mean, the example he didn't. That's that's. I think we all have common knowledge on. We wish he'd written a different book.
Yep.
Yep.
but the issue is he doesn't know that we know we wish he'd read a different book. So, and that's always the problem with being an author in conversation with the community is the community.
Well, these are on YouTube.
Much,
you can find them.
It's much harder to but it's much harder at scale. It's just 5 of us.
Yeah.
And would he spend the time to sit and chat with us about these issues we have with this book versus the thousands of, my guess is this book, sells 100,000 copies because it's minimum at least, maybe more.
Right.
I don't, the economy wasn't great going into the holiday season when this was on offer. So,
Right. But if it sold 100,000 copies, were 25,000 read or 10,000 read?
Yeah. Yeah, it's got one of those titles that definitely looks very good behind one.
Absolutely. Yep.
But tell you chapter 2.
Well, even the Maimonides list was fascinating to see as a list. That somebody had at least spent the time to think through what all these models look like. And now I would love to see a breakdown of each of those lines and how those play out in a bigger span. And I was super fascinated to see, here's a list he made in, God, what had to have been Maimonides, 3rd century? I don't know if he said or not, but but to compare that list with how he would have framed it in what order at that point and what order do we put it in now is fascinating to me.
But I think he did actually get a little into in what order people seem to put them now. As I'm remembering it, it's like,
But that kind of thing is fascinating to me. But it also would be super interesting to see dozens of examples in nonprofit or governmental space of how these things happen and which ones are better. So even when you think about government subsidies for certain things, everyone knows it's the government doing it, but the individual people who pay the taxes don't necessarily know, is the $1,000 I paid in taxes, is that going to support the military or is it going to support, feeding people who are below the 200% of poverty,
right?
And that's doing better. And how does it affect how much you pay in taxes and where those taxes go in terms of how you feel about paying your taxes? Those kinds of things would be super fascinating, and that could be 10 books.
Yeah.
Just on each of those things. But when you set up a structure as a nonprofit, which one of those things do you choose to operate as your model in Maimonides' list? And how does that affect how your charity looks or doesn't look to the general public? Or can you have the guy who makes a small profit on his nonprofit? And, then the other question too is what's he actually doing with that profit that he's making? That wasn't even discussed, but it's, how he spends that profit may affect, you know,
Mhm.
Bill Gates spends decades making a massive profit. Now he's spending the second half of his life trying to give it all away. Does that make him a better person? Will we remember him to 1,000 years from now, 10,000 years from now? Will his name live in history as well as Sargon the Great? You know,
And Ozymandias.
who
Or
knows?
and we can even get to that with half of the sort of the great cultural institutions in the United States or other places are we're fundamentally funded by the profits from slavery. I am fortunate enough to live around the corner from one of the 125 Carnegie. I never remember how you pronounce it. Library, public libraries in New York City, and yeah, he gave away almost everything before he died. He was also a vicious strike breaker who, paid to get strikers killed, kind of thing, But hey, these libraries are still pretty awesome, and
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, but that's in the balance books of the universe. Has he ultimately done more good or more bad? And that
Right.
number
Well,
may
and
change as
he
decades
actually had an
ensue.
opinion about that.
Mhm.
Interestingly, he, in the thing, the essay that it's normally called The Gospel of Wealth, he
Mhm.
talks about the idea that concentrating those profits and concentrating that capital to reinvest and then to make more profits and ultimately getting to the end of your life and becoming a philanthropist is, he said, a net better outcome than paying the workers better because they were just going to blow that money. Right. And so
Yeah.
and so the and so the and this is an argument. I mean, you could think of this as an argument for civilization, right? That it's retained earnings that are retained at the expense of somebody. Now, I'm not going all complete labor
Yeah.
theory of value here, but it is, there is an opportunity cost to retained earnings, and oftentimes that is current spending or wages or things like that. So the idea could, an argument or a discussion could be had, or a book could be written about, how much of civilization is had on the backs of people who, maybe by rights deserved more.
You remind me of there was a bot that would occasionally calculate and tweet out the number of Great Pyramids of Giza that could have been built with the amount of time wasted on watching the Gangnam Style video on YouTube. Billions of watches, and it's so towards Carnegie's perspective. Hey, would we be better off if we helped focus people's attention and work on something useful and beneficial? Or, as any parent of a teenager knows, your kid could go out and do the dishes or rake the leaves in the lawn, but if you leave them to their preferences, they're going to sleep in until noon and then waste all day playing video games or scrolling on their phones. And
Right.
is that the better of the things that they could have been doing, or is there some middle ground?
Well, and
You know,
ultimately, does society and should society operate in that kind of paternalistic way? That there are people who are, I mean, this is like platonic, right? There are
yeah.
people who know better, who are trained to know better, who are more maybe public spirited, but you know how do we deal with that? How do we assess that? How do we police that? All, you know, all those questions.
Yeah.
You brought up that sort of zero sum thing again, and yeah, I sort of my contrast is to all this is sort of the Tom Sawyer approach of you talk somebody into thinking, hey, it'd be fun if you go and paint that. It'd be fun if you go
Right.
paint that fence for me. Engage people at stuff. Give people. And good Lord, I worked for a while with this young woman, um, who had been so incredibly well raised. I mean, her parents somehow or other were able to, be exemplars of really good behavior. They would set up these competition between her and her brother on who could make their Halloween candy last the longest. That is just genius and a wonderful person to work with, and just a great person overall. But this again, there are ways to be an exemplar of good behavior if we assume good. And again, we get into none of that in this book.
Well,
But,
some of those questions bring us back to David Graeber's, like, how does a society decide it's going to live? So we now, roughly following Christianity, it is now kind of it's a cultural norm that we think those who do good get good, versus 2000 years before that, life is chaotic and you don't know what's going to happen, and you try to appease the gods in hopes that you have a better life. But the idea of people who do good get good was not a thing. It was, you do what you do and you're going to get what you get, and it's just all random chance.
well, that's Calvinism.
And so how do those two modes of thinking change what your philosophy of life is? Or if you live on Turtle Island and you have those ideas and thoughts and beliefs, and you have ideas of Thanksgiving and gratitude and abundance, life is one way, versus you live in maybe a post-capitalistic or a peak capitalism society. How you live is dramatically different than how you might have lived 1,000 years ago in an indigenous culture. And which is the better way? Is it Carnegie's philosophy is the better way, or maybe
Well,
not?
and also there's that, you know, do yeah, Carnegie, you know, bad guy. Um, William Clay Frick, probably worst guy.
Amazing
And he
museum.
was the guy who
I was
implemented.
just to the new. They just redid the Frick Museum, his house, and oh, it's gorgeous. It
Yeah,
really is lovely.
right,
But yes,
right. But
even worse than Carnegie. Yes.
yeah, but and so I guess, maybe we need more vocabulary about, about people's characteristics and stuff. Sorry, go ahead, Thomas.
I've got a question from chapter 5.
Mhm.
So he's talking about Alan Fisk, and Alan Fisk and his diversity in human culture. And Fisk proposed that all human relationships fall into just 4 kinds, and traditional culture is just 3. And he goes through 2 of them. And I kept on thinking I was missing the 3rd and the 4th, and I have gone back over it. I'm like, and it's not the first time Pinker has done this. He's like, there are 6 things, and he will like go through 3 of them. I'm like, what the hell?
Yeah.
At least like name them and like, we don't need to talk about
Which
them
page was
here.
that on, Thomas?
I
know
on
I marked it,
Kindle,
but
I've got page 170 is where it
170
starts.
to
Okay.
175ish, it looks like, the whole conversation.
Yeah.
You
And
guys know
then
who? I don't even know who this guy is. So I don't know if anybody here
I
does.
don't.
Yeah.
I was
There
guessing that
was
it was that the categories that he was talking about were the things that are in the all caps.
Yeah, the all
yeah.
caps, and
So
there
he's
are
got.
four. There are 4 of them.
So I've got. Which are the 4?
Um,
Because I've got.
Solidarity is physical at the top of the page. Then solidarity is kinship, and then solidarity is being made of the same flesh. And then further at the middle part of the page, solidarity is having the same mind. Those are the 4.
I am not
But he
seeing it.
definitely does give them different treatments in terms of how in depth. And I actually I marked that section too, and I was like, I totally want to read this thing this guy has written.
Yeah, I'm looking for
But there are also things that
bulb.
he calls authority ranking and equality matching and market pricing, right?
Yeah,
So yeah, it sounds like it's a complex argument that Pinker has only given us a little glimpse on from his own perspective for his own purposes.
I may have a defective Kindle version because
I
I
mean,
don't have anything
the tough part
like.
about this is he makes references to all these great things I want to go read. And my hope was that he would be distilling the best of these things down into better chunks for me to not
Yeah,
have to go read those things.
Mhm.
Um, but
yeah,
this is also part of the issue of the complexity of it's easy to see that, which is what he's saying is I've read we presume he's read all these things. So he's trying to draw for Thomas's river analogy, he's giving us all the stepping stones to get across the river. But the problem is we haven't read all the things to know that it is easy to see. So that
Mhm.
means you've got to do way more work to pull it all together.
Mhm.
yeah. There's sort of the yeah.
And as lazy
There
humans,
was
do we want to do that?
there was quite a few
Carnegie would
things
say
he
yes,
Well,
we
there's a
should.
benefit cost
yeah.
calculation there too.
There's quite a few things that he brings up that they're works that I'm familiar with, and I'm like, oh, he's bringing up Goffman, and I'm like, oh, this must mean that he's going to go down this path, and I'm like, he just leaves it at the Goffman in the sub piece, and then he'll like sprinkle in Goffman's a little bit later, and then moves on. I'm just like, and then there was like 5 or 6 of those where I'm just like, oh, this is really good and rich. I'm like, this is going to really help explain,
Mhm.
and just sort of throws it in and then jumps.
Well, and do you get the sense? I mean, that's analogous to what I was saying about the banking. Do you get the sense
Yeah,
that he understands Goffman, adequately?
yeah.
And you know,
Goffman isn't tough.
okay, I,
Um,
I don't know him,
it,
so I'm just
it's it's not directly behind me at the moment, but like Goffman's used a ton in social sciences, and his main work is the presentation of self,
hmm,
and just like different faces for different communities and different understandings. We interact differently depending on who we're around, and it's all context
mhm,
aware. But we are not necessarily aware that we are doing it. Like when we're talking to our parents, we tell them one story of what we did on Friday night, and when we're talking to our friends we were out with, we have a completely different conversation.
right, yeah. Yeah. What about these, in terms of these things that we present, because that's the last chapter that we read, right? These
Hmm.
things that we present to I mean, laughing, crying, and blushing are apparently
Yeah,
involuntary to to a great extent, but eye
yeah,
contact is
yeah.
is not. So
It,
those are the anchors of his chapter.
yeah, eye contact is very cultural, well, quasi-cultural. And
And
I
gendered.
didn't, yeah, yeah. In high school, in summer school, had a history class. And myself and one other student, we realized if we made eye contact with the teacher and held it, she would completely lose her train of thought.
Oh, wow.
Um, and we were just like, what is going on here? And and we got the whole class doing it. And it was just very funny. But then went to go visit my girlfriend in France, in Lyon, and was on a bus. And I'm like, it was like one of my first few days there, and was on a bus by myself, just running some errands. And I'm like, made eye contact with this woman and like broke it, and then made eye contact again, didn't quite break it, but was also trying to figure out there was a difference in just sort of posture, different things culturally. She seemed very French, and I was trying to figure out in my head what makes her seem very French. I had her following me when I got off the bus for blocks. And I'm like, I don't know what's going on. And when I got back to the apartment, my girlfriend's like, what's wrong? I'm like, I had this woman following me for a long time. And she's like, well, did you make eye contact? And I'm like, maybe. She's like, did you not break the eye contact? I'm like, after a while, I'm like, I didn't. And she's like, oh, this is flirting and it is very serious. And I'm like, it is a known, if you don't break it, you are like off to find a place that's horizontal.
Yep.
I'm like, I had no idea. And I'm like I thought I was like involved in some sort of spy intrigue or something. I'm just like, oh, like this is not good. I've got somebody tailing
Meanwhile,
me.
this poor woman is like, he's gone past 15 hotels. What
Right.
the hell is the problem?
Right. And he knows that I know, but I
Yeah.
don't know that he knows that he doesn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was just like, I'm like, when I was reading the eye contact thing, I'm like, where is this going to go? I'm like, okay, he covers it,
Yeah.
Right
but
at
I'm
the
like,
top.
it
Yeah,
is
yeah.
very cultural.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's right at the top. If you'll stare at somebody's eyes for more than 5 seconds, you're either going to kill them or fuck them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
I'm
Yep.
going to look over here at the chat on the side for a minute.
Well, he gets into that too, though.
He
I don't
does.
know
Yeah, there's a thing about
about
why
online.
the
Yeah.
online experience is different.
Mhm. Yeah.
And
There in that
wasn't there
chapter.
some AI could control it? That would really mess things up or something like that.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah.
Or they
But
even
that would
have
be a
like fake eyes or something. And
that would be a real uncanny valley thing. Yeah.
oh yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But this is also the chapter where he talks about how he's talking to the New Yorker cartoon editor, and he gives him his theory of humor, and the
Mhm.
guy corrects him, but then he convinces himself that he won that argument.
I did like some of the, because over the span of my lifetime, and I watch probably way too much stand-up comedy, but I'm always fascinated by laughter and what makes people laugh and what are the forms of comedy and types and how would you categorize it all? And so some of this was some interesting tidbits and some really
Mhm.
great pointers,
Mhm.
um, that just tripled my reading list.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think the subverting expectations thing is accurate, right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, especially if you're a Jimmy Carr fan, because he'll
Yeah.
start in and you think he's going one direction, and then wait a second.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I just saw. I watched the latest Chappelle special the other
Oh
night.
yeah, what'd you think of that? Because I love that. It was
I loved it.
awesome.
I loved it,
Like
and especially the very last line.
No spoilers, please.
But
I
they well,
had
and he tells this story about the Falcon too, and then it comes back later, and it was just yeah. I mean, it's so. I mean, it's timed well. The callbacks are perfect, and yeah, it was.
I had an interesting experience, maybe three-quarters of the way through it when he started getting into some of the MLK stuff. That I've had experiences where I have laughed so hard that you cry.
Mhm.
But then I had an experience in his at that comedy show that I don't think I've ever had before, where I was almost crying to laugh,
Yeah,
which was the total polar opposite of
yeah,
that
the
thing. And
opposite direction. Yeah,
I don't think I've ever had that experience before. So,
yep.
God bless
It-
Dave Chappelle for that.
Oh, and the way that he told that the twist in that story. Yeah, I mean, Will, you're gonna like this. It's really well done.
I, I've always enjoyed Mr. Chappelle.
Yeah. So that
Well, and he's
yeah.
gone from or wait, it's more interesting to watch the span of his career because he starts out really on the raunchy side and he's now moved to comedy philosopher
yeah.
in a way that is more interesting than just straight, I'm going to stand up here and tell you jokes.
Hmm.
Mhm.
It's I'm going to teach you something and you're going to learn something by listening to the jokes that comedy, you know, sometimes occasionally had,
Oh,
before, but usually it was more, oh, here's just a bunch of dick jokes,
yeah,
um, for dick joke's sake,
yeah,
and this is it's that, but it's also not that.
mhm, yeah,
Um,
yeah. And I think it is more kind of philosophical even than, I mean, there were people who did, sort of politics on the edge of philosophy, right? Like Carlin,
yeah,
but this, yeah, this is more sort of um, staking out an actual, without talking about, stoicism or something the way Jimmy Carr
yeah,
does. Um, yeah,
yeah. He doesn't. He's not as on the nose as. And but my guess is that Carr is reading
yeah,
these philosophies and then coming up with comedy that meets that.
right.
Whereas I don't get the impression that Chappelle does that, and it's lived experience that Chappelle's talking about and
Yeah,
pointing out the thing. So he's his
right.
own school of philosophy.
Yeah, which is no less, I think, legit
Yeah.
and doesn't have any less weight for me, I think.
Well, I wonder, like, what do we call his school of philosophy, and are people talking about it 2,000 years from now?
Like the Sermon on the
You
Mount.
know, the Chappelle, the Chappelleisms.
Yeah. Well, Chappelle's, I mean, and a lot of it has to do with, kind of these stories of, of people who kind of persevered against, kind of severe, um, not only just, just the odds against them, but kind of real persecution. So there is a real, there is kind of a real black experience element to it as
Yeah.
well,
Well, and if you compare it to the Eddie Murphy documentary that just came out,
which I haven't seen.
which is, and there's an interesting thing that's been happening in our culture over the last decade or so. Um, Elton John was one of the first to do it, and then so he did a movie that was a biopic of his life that he produced. Then Queen comes out and they've got their own biopic that they produced.
Right.
Eddie Murphy has this what looks like a documentary, but it's and full background. I worked for the production company that actually made this Eddie Murphy thing, and they made the Doctor Dolittle movies. So they've worked with Eddie Murphy in the past. So there's a pre-existing relationship, but they create this documentary that's done in a documentary style, but it's made by people who know him with his tacit consent. And also, he's essentially a producer on it.
Mhm.
So nothing in this documentary is going to get past him that puts him in a bad or a horrible light. So it's not a traditional documentary, even though that's the style of it. So it's kind of these entertainers or people with this platform are given the ability to create their own future history by
Mhm.
telling their own story,
Yeah.
which is,
Authorized biographies, though,
you
for
know,
decades. I mean, the authorized biography of sports figure, of this figure, of that figure. I mean, those were, back in the, I think Sinatra had one,
Mhm.
I mean, 60s or 70s or whatever, and on and on and on. I mean,
Or
so
Walter Isaacson writing about Elon.
Jesus.
Yeah.
or Steve Jobs,
Oh,
Yeah.
Jesus.
Or Steve
you know,
Jobs, right?
like
Yeah.
here is my legacy. And these, because of the size and scope that they are, this is the impression everyone's going to walk away with for the next 50 or 100 years
Yeah.
versus, you know,
I,
But
I mean, even an autobiography, though, is like, I mean, again, one of the, it, it, I'm not going to put it on the list because I don't particularly feel like reading it again as a proposal, but like one of the best autobiographies out there is Ulysses S. Grant's.
yeah.
It is an amazing. I mean, I had no idea what a thoughtful and interesting person he is. And he is actually pretty self-effacing and honest about a lot of things about you know, but people have been putting out, they are their own storyteller about themselves, and that's
Yeah.
and again, U.S. Grant's autobiography has generally been, is sort of the gold standard, I think, of, and again, somebody
You know
here's a,
why
Credit to
it's
Mark
the gold.
Twain for that.
yeah,
Yeah,
well, Mark
yeah.
Twain encouraged him to write it, but he didn't write it.
Okay.
That
Well, you encouraged him to write it, but it also, that autobiography marks essentially the first, outside of the Bible, the first modern bestseller.
yeah.
And
The guys of the people in the Grand Army of the Republic, veterans going door to door selling it in advance. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of these, I think it's a good point, Will, that, these documentaries aren't, balanced documentaries in the format that we may have expected. But then again, that expectation may or may not be realistic, right? Walter
yeah,
Cronkite was the most trusted man in America, in the 60s or whenever, and you know, God, was it Malcolm Gladwell bashed Matt Taibbi for that at that Monk debate, right? Oh, you just want a good old fashioned, white world where, the white man was the most trusted person and all of that. And which I thought was really unfair. And I think the reality of it was more that, this was like peak manufactured consent, right? The,
yeah.
the, the stuff that was going through, the CBS Evening News.
And it was done at a time when there was zero chance that he could ever have been Me Too'd.
Yeah. Oh, sure.
I mean, it was only hit and miss that even JFK got tagged with Marilyn Monroe anything
Yeah.
because of who he was and where he was. And the press was willing to like cover up and not do TMZ style journalism on any of these people. So,
Right. Right.
you know,
But also, the idea that, I mean, it is nostalgic to think, well, everybody was on the same page. It was a fictional page,
yeah, yeah.
but
Well,
everybody knew that
it
everybody
would
knew that they had watched, everybody had watched
it would be
either
interesting.
Cronkite or Huntley and Brinkley or David
Yeah.
Reasoner that night, and heard the same thing.
It would be kind of interesting if, in the style of Stephen King, like retelling the JFK story, like if somebody were to go and take, and that's the way it is, and turn that in, but write a retrospective historical fiction of he was totally a Me Too crazy and
Mm,
doing all these things in the background that just never were told or reported,
right.
but just to twist the knife and make an interesting
Right.
like fiction.
Right. Are you saying that because it would be interesting, Chris, or because
Oh
there
no,
is a
I
story
this would
like
be a
that?
fascinating like
Yeah.
retelling of a his of
Okay. Because
what
I've never
we.
heard that about Cronkite, but I guess,
Oh no, I'm not accusing him of anything. I'm just
okay.
saying,
Well,
and
I
I'm
mean, you're
specifically
connected.
saying
It's possible that you would know something.
totally right. It is full on fiction
Okay. Yeah.
of, God, what I watched an episode and a half of. There's a comedian who's got a series on Netflix that is just the most bizarre, and I'm totally gonna forget his name. 40s something white guy, and the pilot, he starts out as he's a hitman for like the CIA,
Mm,
but he accidentally kills a woman instead of the target. And he's talking in the background, and it's very spy thrillery, like, I don't kill women, I don't kill kids. And then literally in the span of 5 minutes, he kills a woman who's a total innocent. He screws up his mission. He shits his pants and is walking around the street buck naked.
ah,
And, and then he's about to kill himself, and he pulls the trigger on his sniper rifle and misses himself and kills a baby.
oh,
Just like, it is the most perverse, like, it's like a teenage boy, I'm gonna write some fiction,
mm,
and the most perverse and Netflix has put it on, and it's a hit series.
mm.
Um,
Interesting.
Hard something.
if you
I'll think of it in a minute, the name, but it's like, oh my God, like they actually made this.
Hmm.
And it is just so perverse, the plotting and what's happening, and you don't know how to make heads or tails of it because it's just so out of left field.
Hmm.
But
It sounds very
to
it sounds
write a
very close to In Bruges,
yeah,
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's that kind of.
but different.
But it would be interesting to take Cronkite and just have a total fiction of the other side of his life, the other piece of the story you never heard, like,
Mhm.
Hmm.
you
There
know.
are two examples sort of along that line that I think are interesting. Uh, One is Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, which was made into a film that was a lot of fun, but the book is amazing. It's the Gong Show guy, and
Jeff
he
Barry.
is yeah, he's
By
telling.
the way, that's one of my favorite screenplays of all time.
Well, the book again. I read the original book is amazing too because it is fascinating that it's both a actually fairly realistic autobiographical story of the rise of network of game shows and network television and everything, interspersed with what I it, what is fun to enjoy his story that he's telling of being a CIA assassin.
Wow.
Um, yeah, he says that he says that while he was working, doing these game show things and everything, he was also killing people for the CIA.
Wow.
And it is amazing. It's a fairly short book if you can read it too. I get the film's good, but the book is better. I've probably
The
read it 6 times.
the screenwriter is Charlie Kaufman, who
Yeah.
also he adapted Susan
Goes into
Orlean's Orchid Stories, and he also did Being
yeah,
John Malkovich.
of
The
course.
guy is just a crazy genius, off the wall writer that,
Hmm.
you know.
If you because I know if you've read the screenplay, give yourself a chance to read the book because it is he didn't yeah Kaufman didn't have to go very far. It's there. But then the sort of other more general approach. I mean, if we really want to get on fictionalized biographies, there's a speculative writer called Tim Powers, um, who writes these sort of alternative. He'll take historical facts and uh, push in a bunch of plausible magic,
Hmm.
sort of supernatural things or whatever. The big one recently was Declare. This was, I think, maybe 10 years ago. It's a bestseller. And it's an alternate version of basically the Kim Philby Cold War spying thing, imagining that in fact, well, he takes all the dates, facts, and personalities and everything in there. It says, oh, but it was really about genies, as in sort of desert gene kind
Hmm.
of thing. Yeah, it's fascinating. Um, but anyway, but
Cool.
yeah.
All right. So next week we're gonna talk about the rest of it, right?
Probably.
The rest of the story.
I think we're gonna end it. So
Politics and
do we
books.
have? Did we choose a next book?
No, but I think there's a lot of consensus around MOR.
Yes, I thought so too. Yeah. Let me just see. I haven't been in the. Yeah. So what is this? What is the deal with this Moon Reader? I'm just looking in the.
Oh, it's just a I mean, it's one of the probably more popular EPUB readers out there, and I think it was originally built for Android.
Hmm.
And it's a pay. I think I paid $4 or $5 for it ages ago, and I use it mostly for reading EPUB books that aren't in Amazon Kindle format, or if I have something in a Kindle format and I can convert it and put it. It's easy to put on other platforms more than the Amazon stuff.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't know, a decade ago, I read a whole bunch of stuff using RSVP, rapid serial visual presentation technology. So it's a reading app that will throw one word in the center of your screen, at 200 They usually start about 250 words a minute, which is about average reading speed.
Oh, right, right, right.
Hmm.
But you can crank it up, most of them, to about 1,800 words a minute. And it takes you a while to play around with it. But you can very easily read, especially fiction's way easier. You could not
Mm.
reading this book at 1,000 words a minute would be probably painful for your head.
Yeah.
But as a quick first read, you could throw a book like this up and read it at 500 or 600 words, maybe 700 words a minute. And that would be your inspectional read to get through it pretty quickly. The same way you might use an audiobook format and maybe
Yeah.
do 1.5 or 2x speed.
Right. And do you get kind of a gestalty sense of it?
So you'd get enough of a sense of it reading it really quickly. And you could read it in, I don't know, this probably an hour or so at that speed.
Hmm.
Um, Enough to get a sense of what's going on so that then you could do a more in-depth read. But this ebook reader is one of the few that I have found, and I actually happen to have it and you have used it before in the past, that has this RSVP technology built into it. A lot of times I would, for popular news story articles, there's a bunch of plugins for Chrome and Firefox that do this RSVP, so you can read your news at faster speeds and
Mm.
still comprehend it. Because part of the balance is you can read it really fast, but are you still getting the comprehension out of it? And what RSVP does is it prevents, mostly you read slowly because saccadic eye movement of your eyes. So RSVP lets you read it 2 or 3 times your natural speed without losing the comprehension that you would otherwise
That's
lose.
cool.
So,
That's cool.
you
Hey, I'm
know,
looking in the I guess the community forum is still here, but oh, okay, there are okay, all right. I guess it was the page I was in. It was not showing me all the things in the sidebar, and I was thinking, holy crap, did a bunch of stuff get deleted? But it looks like not. Okay, so I was alarmed there for a second, but back to normal. Um,
Looking
yeah,
at
I
MOR,
think the Immerbar does have kind of some momentum behind it, and I'd like to do that. The
well, and it's topical now too that we're, invading other countries and taking over.
Yeah, right, right. How to hide it? Although it doesn't look like we're that interested in hiding it. Let's see. Is there a how to hide?
depends on how you frame we.
We, yes, that's always the thing, right? I mean, I thought that when we were talking a little bit earlier about, America's kind of position. I don't know. There's got to be one in there somewhere. I'm scrolling through, and he must be way down there, Immerbar. Um,
It's at the top and the
oh, is
newer
it?
suggestions in book suggestions. It's the top one in
Oh,
newer
I'm
suggestion.
sorry. I was looking at the Tim
Community.
the Tim version, which
Ah,
wasn't at the top. I'll have to delete that again. Um, yeah, there is a
yeah, Mark hadn't put his name or a vote for it.
well, I
So,
will. I'm following the link to
okay.
Amazon. I guess I bought it in 2019. Look at that. And I haven't read it yet. So there we go. Yeah, I'm actually thinking of Chris. I've been getting your mailing list stuff from your blog daily and then weekly, and I've been thinking of a lot of that's been kind of a little bug in my ear. I've been
Ooh.
thinking about that because I'm thinking of kind of moving all my stuff to either my own web page or a WordPress, and kind of owning it all myself rather than having it out there on kind of just YouTube and
Uh,
Substack. What do you think about the in 30 seconds or less the relative benefits of WordPress versus having 100% your own thing?
Um, I would presume WordPress is going to be around for a minute or two, so I wouldn't worry about it as much as I'd worry about other platforms. If you want
yeah.
to do the quick and easy, let them do all the stuff.
So
But
you're
you
talking
are,
about
The Yeah.
You're talking
Like
about through a
WordPress
service or what? Or
dot
through,
com, like as a
Yeah.
service. I
Yeah.
presume that's the question you're asking is let
yeah,
WordPress do the work for me versus me having my own WordPress.
Right. Yeah. Just put my domain, let them sell me a domain and,
Yeah.
and host it on
okay.
their servers. Yeah.
Yeah, because
Um,
I mean, I do
The-
WordPress stuff, but it's through I rent server space from
Yeah.
Bluehost.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And, that's
Yeah.
um,
I
more
was thinking of
expensive.
doing
You
it
can
directly
spend a
with
lot of money
WordPress
that way.
rather than just
it's quick
using.
and easy, but you lose the plugin ecosystem if you want it to do other things that it doesn't do. You just kind of you get what you get and you don't get upset. But
Yeah.
if you want to pay them money then for those plugins,
Right.
it becomes super expensive. So if you want to do
Yeah.
that, my recommendation, because they make it super cheap and easy and they have support for it, um, Reclaim Hosting in Virginia
Okay.
specializes in higher ed,
Oh,
like server space,
I think I've had an account with them before. Yeah.
and they're stupidly cheap for
Yeah.
like
reclaim.
50 to 100 bucks
Right.
a year. You can have your own domain and do whatever you want, and they provide tutorials on how to do all the stuff with all their things that
Yep.
and so if for a class you want to spin up a WordPress instance for X, Y, or Z, they try to make doing that super easy.
Right.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
I had a domain and an account with them that I think has only just recently expired because I was too lazy to keep it
yeah,
up.
I think I don't really use it very often, but I have one just to support them and the mission that they're doing. It's
Mhm.
almost as if I treat them almost as a nonprofit because their their prices are comparatively stupidly low for,
There you
and
go.
if you need service, you can call somebody and get somebody on the phone. They'll help you out.
Well, there's
Like,
some philanthropy.
you know,
Yeah.
So
The
Any
good thing
host is
about
going to handle WordPress. And again, WordPress it self maintains itself. It's for the last decade. It's automatic updates and everything.
right. Right.
It's there's not
yeah.
much administration to do.
Yeah.
And if
Yeah.
you want to move to something else, everything imports from
Yeah.
WordPress, which
That
is
was
the
that was
great
kind of my
thing.
thinking was, yeah, if I wanted to do it in a couple of steps. I mean,
well,
in the day, I used to. I mean, God, I remember what was the Microsoft thing? Front page. I
Oh God.
loved
Yeah.
that. I loved that. And then I had to, and then when that died, I had to move to, I thought I might move to Adobe, but that was the learning curve was too steep on that. So I got like Rapid Weaver, and and I
Yeah.
managed my own thing on that for a while.
um, the one thing I worry
On
about more is like the size of the database because I'm now pushing upwards of a gigabyte of text almost
Yeah,
on my WordPress install, which is insane,
yeah.
just stupidly insane.
Right, right. Well, and the other thing that I'm fascinated with is kind of that the capability of linkage. So I still am very interested in the Obsidian publish kind of thing. If I can make it, sort of massively backlinked and bidirectionally linked, but that's a long-term project.
If you want to do it pretty quickly, there's a WordPress plugin called Web Mention
Hmm.
that when you
Mhm.
mention somebody else's web page, it sends notifications back and forth, or you can receive them as well. So if somebody in the blogosphere is talking about your website, you'll get pings as comments, um, which I found kind of fascinating over the last decade. And
Hmm.
it kills me that that's if that if that functionality had existed in 2005, we would not see social media as social media is
Right,
today.
right. I mean, that's
I
that's
guarantee
that's
it.
The
that's
big
like
part of
Jaron
movable
Lanier's
type.
Promised Land.
That was a big part of movable type was the with backlinks or whatever they're called.
Yep.
Yeah. It was built in then,
Yeah.
And there is again a less there's sort of backlinks. Again, I suddenly can't remember what it's called because I'm losing my words. But it was a built-in function. It's still actually a built-in function in
I'm
WordPress.
gonna keep
In
saying
the
that. I say,
commenting and
have more creatine.
uh, it's all people. Uh, but
Yeah. Yeah, cool. Well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'll be, I mean, it's going to be, I'm not going to make any immediate changes or anything, but I'm starting to think about that again as I think about, my future in education and on the web. So anyways, next week we finish and then we'll continue with Immerver. So
Cool.
sounds good.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Good talk.
Hi, folks.
Ciao.
Enjoy.